Now every child has a personal allowance, so they can use their personal allowance. It's the same as anybody else's in the UK. They also have their annual exemption for capital gains tax purposes, which at the moment is 12,300, and they should be looking to use that up to. When can children work is a common question. Age 13 or over, they can work part-time because they'll be at school, although they'll be schooled at home. However, that doesn't apply to children who are. So should you add children to your business or company as shareholders and directors? Well, you can add them as shareholders at any time, and there's no restriction. I'm not saying any time, I mean at any age. However, in order for them to be directors, they have to be age 16 or over, apart from certain limited exceptions. And when you do add them as shareholders, make sure that the articles of association do not prohibit them from being shareholders. So what are the key or two main advantages? The first one is, of course, if you give capital assets to them, then it's going to reduce your capital gains tax exposure, because if you give that asset to them, let's say in 5 years time, the asset's worth more, and when you gift it, it's deemed to be at market value because it's a connected party, it's market value anyhow, which means you'll have a higher capital gains tax bill. So gifting it earlier helps you with that. It also helps you to reduce and mitigate your inheritance tax exposure, so it's good for that. And secondly, it's good for the children because it gives them an income stream, which means they can use up their personal allowance. However, for children who are minors and they've been gifted assets by you, any income over the first £100 in any tax year is taxable on you. So you would have to pay that tax. So that's caught by the settlements legislation, which isn't good for you or the child. Very quickly looking at some of the disadvantages of giving shares to your children, and the first one is that the child can relinquish their obligations placed on them as a shareholder. They also won't be bound by any contractual obligations by being a shareholder, unless especially if it's not something to do with necessaries, which I'll cover for you in a short while. Any income over £100, as I've said earlier, is taxable on you, so that kind of partly defeats the objective. As you're giving them shares, you're going to fragment control, which means the children may end up having more of a say, and they might not always agree with your proposals, and that might not make you too happy. It might sound alien to you right now. You might think that could never happen to you. I've seen it happen before. I'm just pointing it out for you to be aware. If you've got employees, especially key employees who work in the business, they may have some expectation of having some shares in the future because of their hard work, and if they see your children getting the shares, that might demotivate them, especially if they're working really hard, because they'll be thinking, I'm working hard, doing all this work, not being appreciated or valued enough. That's their perception, by the way. You might have a different view, and their children aren't doing any work in the business. I'm creating all the equity, and yet they are getting shares and I'm not. So that's something to bear in mind. It can make funding harder, so certain lenders don't like it, especially if children aren't minority shareholders. So if they own less than 25%, it might make it a tad bit easier, but if they own more than 25%, it's going to make it harder. But certain lenders don't even like it when it's less than 25% or 20%. So that's something that you should bear in mind. Also, if you give shares to some of your siblings, maybe the older ones, and not to the younger ones, it may make the younger ones resent the older ones. So that's something that you should bear in mind. Now, every child has a personal allowance, so they can use their personal allowance. It's the same as anybody else's in the UK. They also have their annual exemption for capital gains tax purposes, which at the moment is 12,300, and they should be looking to use that up to. When can children work is a common question. Age 13 or over, they can work part-time because they'll be at school, although they'll be schooled at home. However, that doesn't apply to children who are actors, performers or models, because they could be younger, and as long as they have a performer's license, they'll be okay. In terms of minority shareholdings and what kind of power or authority do those minority shareholders have? Well, if they have more than 25% stake in the business, they can block special resolutions in terms of changing articles of association, changing the name of a company. If they own 15% or more of the shares, they can apply to a court to object to a variation of share classes and rights. If they own 10% or more, they can demand a poll vote at a general meeting, which is just going to be aggravation for you if you're the majority shareholder. And if they own 5% or more of the shares, they can ask for circulation of written resolutions in writing beforehand, which again is going to be problematic for you. So what you should be thinking about doing is, if you want to give some of your assets to your children, if you give them in one go, there could be capital gains tax payable. So you want to be giving them piecemeal, so you use up your £12,300 annual exemption every year by giving them bit by bit over a certain number of years, so you don't have to pay capital gains tax. That would be useful for you. But remember, the assets that you give them, the income derived from those assets above the first £100 is taxable on you. So you have to bear that in mind. However, gifts given by grandparents, i.e. your parents or your spouse's parents, to your children, any future income derived from those assets is taxable on the child or the children and not you. So that's good. Something else which you might want to think about, and I think you ought to think about, is having alphabet shares. So these would be A, B, C, D, or a different class of shares, and you would give those to the children, and you would attribute any future growth to that class of share. So as the child gets older, and once they're over 18, they'll have a certain class of share, and the growth of those shares from the day you gave them the shares of the company will go into those shares, and you can have different classes for different children. If your children were born before the 2nd of January 2011, then you can use child trust funds, and you can put up to £9,000 in a child trust fund alongside a junior ISA, so you could do £4,500 each, which is pretty generous, because last year the limit was 4,368, so it's just over doubled now, and that's something you should think about. No income tax payable and no capital gains tax payable on that when the child reaches 18, which is good. Also, if you gift shares to your children when they reach the age of 18, it will be helpful, because obviously at 18 the income tax will be payable by them. So if they go to university, for example, they can get some dividends, which saves you obviously taking out dividends and probably paying tax at a higher rate, and then they can use those dividends to fund their university fees or their living and accommodation expenditure. But something to bear in mind is, when a child is a shareholder and they're under the age of 18 and they lack the capacity to enter into a contract, they are not obligated by that contract unless it is for certain necessities, those necessities being food, clothing or education, i.e. apprenticeships or schooling. So that means they can come out of that contract whenever they like. So that's something for you to bear in mind. I hope you found that useful, and think about obviously capital gains tax mitigation, inheritance tax mitigation, income tax mitigation when you're looking to give shares to your children. Unfortunately, quite often I find people think about inheritance tax way too late. So when their parents are pretty old, I think that conversation should be had earlier, and you should try and give something away regularly so that you limit your capital gains tax exposure and your inheritance tax exposure. Hope you found that useful. Until next Friday, bye for now.